Good evening. Welcome to this fine event. Welcome you on behalf of the Institute of Politics. The purpose thereof being to inspire young people into public life, a challenging adventure in these times. Ambassador Sasser, it is very difficult. I was going to say my distinguished colleague who has just made a giant partisan shot at our president. Oh, no, wait, that wasn't what. No, I didn't. There was just seemed to be an old recording. No, Jim Sasser. We served together for 16 years. He is the junior and later the senior senator from Tennessee. He's chaired the Senate Budget Committee and a number of subcommittees, including the Appropriations Committee, Subcommittee on Military Construction. This is where you come and throw yourself on the floor in front of him and say, we need more facilities at Warren Air Base. Oh yes, well, stand up, get off the floor, and we'll talk about it. And we would go then throw ourselves down again to whatever air base or fort or whatever for whatever housing position of raw power. He was on the Banking Committee, Subcommittee on International Finance and Monetary Policy, Governmental Affairs Subcommittee on General Services, Federalism, and the District of Columbia, and the Appropriations Committee Subcommittee on the Legislative Branch, and that was a serious one because that was our own money. But and we did take good care of ourselves in that position. Now, after leaving the Senate and prior to assuming his current duties, Senator Sasser was a fellow right here at the Kennedy School's Institute of Politics. And it was great to have him here, and I know the same experience that others who have been here as fellows. He worked as an attorney in the District of Columbia and Tennessee. He also served as the chairman of the Democratic Party of Tennessee from 1973 to 1976, graduate of Vanderbilt University and Vanderbilt University School of Law. He's married to Mary G. Sasser, and she is here this evening with Ann, and welcome Mary, and they have two wonderful children. I know them, James and Elizabeth. So as I say, we served together for 16 years. We legislated together. We traveled together. Mary, Ann, Jim, and myself. He is a very able, steady man, a very tough adversary, a spirited partisan, a thorough legislator, And he and Mary are very nice friends. And I personally am very proud to have him representing our country in the People's Republic of China and doing a very splendid job. Jim Sasser.
Well, thank you very much, my great friend and colleague, Alan Simpson. Why did you say any of those good things about me on the floor of the Senate when we were serving together? In any case, it's great to be here and see Senator Simpson once again, to hear his wry sense of humor once again in operation, to see his lovely wife Ann, and return to the hallowed halls of the Kennedy School and the Institute of Politics. That was indeed a nice introduction, Alan, and I thank you for it. I remember some years ago when I was still in politics, you remember how we used to curry favor with the publishers of newspapers and powerful managing editors of newspapers? Well, I was being introduced by one to a luncheon meeting one day, and my staff had given him a long biographical sketch, hoping that he would give me a flowery introduction. So he handed it to me and he said, "Jim, do you want me to read all of this?" So wishing to appear modest, I said, "No, not very much. Don't say much." So he got up and he said, "Ladies and gentlemen, I present to you Senator Jim Sasser, and the less said about him, the better." So I very much appreciate your introduction tonight, Alan. In over 2 years as ambassador to China, I've often been reminded of Disraeli's observation that, and I quote, "There's no education like adversity," because adversity is exactly what I've experienced over the past 2 years. Even before I set out for China in early 1996, our bilateral relationship was at a low ebb, and shortly after I arrived in Beijing, the Chinese military began conducting exercises and firing missiles off the coast towards Taiwan. Now, I assure you, Alan, that had nothing to do with my arrival. And U.S. aircraft carriers appeared quickly in the South China Sea. Crisis meetings were being held by the National Security Council in the White House. Now, we've come a long way since that day. And I'd like to take credit for diffusing the situation, but in fact, our leader and leaders had made a clear-headed assessment of the situation already. And I think we learned something about the adversity of that period about 2 years ago, and it was the need to break the cycle of confrontation followed by grudging civility that defined Sino-American affairs in the early 1990s. Today, we can work cooperatively with the Chinese on a number of mutually important issues and still speak with them candidly about our differences, as President Clinton did when he had a joint press conference with President Zhong in Washington just last October. And they discussed human rights right in front of the television cameras and before the people of the world. And as Madeleine Albright has said and has emphasized, engagement, which defines our policy with China, is not necessarily endorsement. Our concerns about such matters as human rights, our nuclear proliferation, have not been fully satisfied, and we have not swept them under the rug. We continue to press on these matters. And the recent track record shows that our new approach, we think, is working. For America, for the United States, the strategic benefits of our official dialogue with China are tangible and growing. We're not yet where we want to be, but the direction is very clear. We have greater interaction based on China's acceptance of and adherence to international norms. I think it was a signal achievement last year when the Chinese signed the Nuclear Test Ban Treaty. Signed the Nuclear Test Ban Treaty when their neighbors, the Indians, refused to sign it, both of them being nuclear powers. And perhaps former President Jimmy Carter said it best. He was in Beijing last July. I accompanied him up to Beidahe, a seaside resort, to see President Zhong. He had a long conversation with the President of China, discussed many things with him, including the problems of Tibet. But when we left, President Carter said that we should rekindle the original vision that led to normalization of relations between the United States and China in the late 1970s. He said we need a dialogue that can foster mutual trust and help us get over the differences that divide us. Well, we've come far, but we have much further to go. At the summit meeting in Washington in October, the two presidents had frank exchanges about how we can best build a constructive, strategic partnership for the 21st century. They were able to make some important commitments at that summit. I'm sorry that these commitments weren't more widely recognized, but here are just a few of them. To work together to halt the spread of nuclear weapons and weapons of mass destruction. what could be more in the vital interest of the people of the United States or the people of the world than for us to work with another nuclear power, potentially troublesome, to halt the spread of nuclear weapons and halt the spread of weapons of mass destruction. We agreed to cooperate on the peaceful use of nuclear energy. We agreed to develop cooperative programs on the rule of law. And I shouldn't mention the name of this institution here in these hallowed halls, but a Yale University Law School professor, Paul Gewirtz, is heading a rule of law initiative, meeting with the Chinese Minister of Justice, and a whole series of meetings are going to continue, forums here in the United States and in China. The two presidents agreed at the summit to advance new energy and environmental projects. Now, commitments are not accomplishments. In the months since that summit, we've accelerated our efforts to address the challenges confronting us. And many distinguished Americans have come to China, furthering our bilateral dialogue. Some have come as officials, some have come unofficially. For example, we just hosted a delegation of three religious leaders, the so-called three wise men, as we referred to them in Beijing: a Baptist fundamentalist, a rabbi, and a Catholic bishop. They went all over China and into Tibet, had a very frank discussion with President Jiang Zemin himself, have filed a report which I have read and I think is interesting and balanced in its approach. The Deputy Secretary of the Treasury, Larry Summers, when the Asian financial crisis was really boiling, flew through Southeast Asia, Korea, and stopped in Beijing and had a very important conversation with the then Vice Premier Zhu Rongji about how China could contribute to alleviating this crisis. China has contributed $1 billion to the International Monetary Fund to aid Thailand, and have indicated that they will also contribute funds to aid Korea through the IMF or even bilaterally. Our chief arms control negotiator, John Holam, has just returned from China. I've been here. I haven't had a chance to talk to him, so I don't know what Mr. Holam has produced. But I think it's interesting and informative that our chief arms negotiator is spending a week in China discussing with them and his counterparts arms control. We've had dozens of members of Congress, numerous governors. The Secretary of Defense was in Beijing in January, Mr. Cohen, and he was shown a super secret facility in Beijing by the Chinese military we did not even know that they owned or that they had. And while there, he signed a military maritime agreement, and I think that demonstrates that America's security in Asia and in elsewhere depends on our respective militaries having a better understanding of one another's strategic concerns. And I am delighted that the Kennedy School has embarked on a program here of bringing senior colonels from the Chinese Army, the People's Liberation Army, here to the Kennedy School to study strategic doctrine, to learn something about how we in the West view the world. Well, the administration's strong support for the religious leaders' visit to the United States, to China, showed that I think we remain steadfast in our conviction that human rights encompass far more than just freedom from want, although that is very important. As I said before, human rights have been a major area of disagreement between our two countries. We recognize, though, that the Chinese people today possess many more options in their daily lives than did their parents. Many more options in their daily lives than they possessed 10 years ago or even 5 years ago. progress is being made in revising the civil and criminal laws of China and permitting a degree of choice now in village elections. You may have seen some of the columns that Tom Friedman of the New York Times dispatched from China just about a month ago, or less, about his observing of village elections in China. China's changing, but the government's repression of political dissent has not changed nearly enough yet for us in the United States and for most of us in the Western world. China's release of Wei Jingsheng, the celebrated dissident, was a major step in the right direction. It was cheered throughout the world. Another encouraging sign is Beijing's recent pledge to sign the International Covenant of Civil and Political Rights. Of course, what China does in practice is more important than what it does on paper. But these declarations do have great value. They set standards that the international community has reason to expect a country that signs it will meet. Now just consider, for instance, in 1975, the Soviet Union signed the Helsinki Act, and that helped transform another part of the world, the Soviet Union and Eastern Europe. And today, it certainly is not recognizable for what it was in 1975. As a result of policies that the Chinese have initiated since 1979, the people of China today enjoy more economic freedoms, increased access to outside sources of information, and greater individual choice. I just saw a Gallup poll. Yes, Alan, the pollsters are even operating in China. But I just saw a Gallup poll with a sample of 3,700 Chinese households. Now, a good national poll in the United States might have 650 samples, but we've got 260 million people, and the Chinese have 1.3 billion. So it's a 3,700 person sample. 2/3 of the Chinese that Gallup polled indicated that the Chinese people expect, now this is the quote, dramatic improvement, close quote, in the quality of their lives over the next 5 years. This same poll indicated that almost an equal percentage of the Chinese people had experienced significant economic enhancement of their lives over the last 5 years, or at least that was their subjective view of it. And this is another interesting example. The survey by Gallup found that people in many cities want better products, they want better services. They want better educational opportunities for their children. They want better government. They want less corruption, and they put a greater value on these things than they do increasing the amount of money that they earn. A national television program has now aired in China, similar in its investigative approach to 60 Minutes. I know that will warm your heart, Senator Simpson. And it's caught the eye of the new premier, Zhu Rongji. And Premier Zhu, we are told, watches it every evening. And he's recommended that his cabinet watch this investigative report on the television as well. So there are some changes that are taking place. And I think the economic successes over the past 2 decades provide a good case for China continuing to loosen central control. Now, we might argue about the human cost of some of these policies, but they have in recent years brought China very high growth rates and low inflation. It is possible, though, in this year of financial retrenchment in Asia, that China itself could experience a downturn in exports and also contracted foreign investment, the most dynamic sectors of its economy in recent years. China will be confronted with several difficult economic challenges. The question comes, can real growth of GDP, which has been moving at around 10%, 9% for a number of years, can growth be maintained while moving forward on the reform of the state-owned enterprises and the reform of the banking system, both of which are necessary to fully restructure the economy and allow it to continue to grow? And the $64,000 question is what's to be done with the displaced and disaffected workers who are going to come into the streets and lose their jobs, not by the tens of thousands, not by the millions, but by the tens of millions when this economic restructuring really gets underway. It's going to be a very difficult balancing act between maintaining stability and continuing the economic reforms that will continue to grow the Chinese economy. And the domestic challenges confronting China are compounded by a new world trade pattern and the financial problems that's now gripping Southeast Asia, Korea, and even to some extent Japan. But China, I think, is starting to indicate that it understands its responsibilities. They stated quite frankly to Deputy Secretary of the Treasury when he was there, Larry Summers, that there would not be a devaluation of the Chinese currency. This has been reiterated publicly by President Jiang Zemin on more than one occasion. They understand this would create serious problems for the Hong Kong dollar, that it would fuel another round of inflation in China, would weaken investor confidence in China's economy, and it would have a disastrous effect on the fragile economies now of Southeast Asia and perhaps of Korea. I indicated earlier that China has been contributing to the International Monetary Fund, and they take great pride in doing that. Well, the Chinese can learn a lot, we think, from the way we Americans deal with economic issues. And they understand that, and they're asking us about it. And already the U.S. Council of Economic Advisors, the Federal Reserve Board, the Treasury Department, and the Department of Commerce are engaged in wide-ranging discussions with their Chinese counterparts. For those of you who are interested in financial matters, last summer, Dr. Alan Greenspan, the chairman of the Federal Reserve Board, was in China, and I accompanied him to see the economic czar, Vice Premier Zhu Rongji, now the new premier. And then Vice Premier Zhu Rongji was chiding Dr. Greenspan about his statement with regard to, what was the statement when the stock market, what was it, Bob? What? Irrational exuberance. He was chiding Greenspan and laughing about his statement about the stock market and irrational exuberance. And then he said, but we had the same problem with the Shanghai stock market. And he said, I watch what you do, and then a little later I do the same thing. So it indicates that that American economic and financial planners are being watched and do have significant influence. As a matter of fact, the Chinese are working to convert the People's Bank of China into a more independent and effective institution, and guess what they're using as the model? The Federal Reserve System of the United States. Well, President Clinton's visit in a few months, I think, is going to define the relationship between the United States and China for the remaining years of the Clinton administration and also into the 21st century. It should accomplish a number of things. First, just as Zhong's visit to the United States in October laid the groundwork for a more normal relationship, I believe Clinton's visit will create a framework for the coming decades that hopefully we can work with. Second, in their discussions about matters of national security, the two presidents will discuss how we can realize our joint responsibility to ensure the peace of the world and the stability of Asia in the 21st century. And finally, just as the people of China came to appreciate the richness of American life during President Zhong's trip to the United States, and his trip to the U.S. was given wall-to-wall coverage in China, all day, on television, in the newspapers, everywhere. And the Chinese people came to know a lot about the United States as a result of that trip. They saw their president at Independence Hall in Philadelphia. What was Independence Hall all about, they asked themselves. They saw their president at Williamsburg. What was Williamsburg all about? They saw their president at Harvard. They saw the demonstrators at Harvard. What are those people demonstrating about? So they saw an enormous amount about the United States on their television sets as a result of President Zhong's visit. Well, I think Americans are going to see and learn a lot about China as a result of President Clinton's visit there. They're going to see the images of China coming back every night on their evening news, and I think they'll also learn something about the Chinese people. And I think if the Chinese people are accurately reflected by our media people, the American people will come to know a people who are in many respects like themselves, a people who are very proud of their heritage, that are hardworking, that are patriotic, that are family-oriented, and are seeking a better life for themselves and their children, and who are very, very optimistic about their future. I read the other day where someone had written that the Chinese today remind them very much of Americans at the turn of the century in 1900, as we were moving forward and taking our place on the world stage, optimistic that we were or were on the verge of being a great power. This writer was saying that the Chinese people very much have that same feeling now. Well, let me conclude with just a few thoughts about the new century. First, new forms of communication, transportation, and technology will make it more imperative that we address problems in a non-traditional way. The Forum on Energy and Environment, which got little attention in this country, which President Gore held in China and inaugurated in China last year, and the discussions that we've had with the Chinese about climate change are new ways of thinking about how we can enhance the quality of life for both of our peoples. The United States is the largest producer of greenhouse gases in the world. China's second and overtaking us very fast and will pass us in the not-too-distant future. And it's imperative that these two great nations work together on these environmental issues. Second, despite what happened in the so-called Asian flu epidemic last July, and despite the storm clouds that currently hang over Asia's future, the 21st century, I think, will be a great achievement for the Asia-Pacific, including China. And the lessons I think the Asians have learned from the adversity presently striking their economies will come out of it with a leaner, meaner, stronger economy, and the dynamics of Asian economies for the future, I think, are going to be stronger. Well, China and the United States are both societies in transition. China is a political system in transition, an economy in transition, indeed a culture in transition. We in the United States are also in transition, but in a slower mode. And both societies in transition are changing to meet the needs of a shrinking and new world. We're not going to see eye to eye with the Chinese about all the implications of these changes. But the quality of our dialogue over these next few years, I think, will be enhanced by the wisdom of the policy that we've pursued over the last few years. Thank you very much. I look forward to taking your questions.
We'll start here with this microphone this evening and then go up this way. And if you could, realizing the time, your questions could be questions. That would be good. Thank you.
Thank you, Senator. Ambassador, thank you for coming tonight. My name is Nahid Nenshi. I'm a graduate student here at the Kennedy School. It's so important that you're here because it's so important for us to start having a dialogue in this country about these vital issues. I wanted to ask you about the report of the religious delegation that you referenced early in your remarks here tonight. As you know, there's been a fair amount of criticism of that report, which you referred to as interesting and balanced, partly because of the methodology. Many are concerned that the Chinese government stage managed that report. You know, there's a lot of things about there was not a Tibetan translator, for example. There was no Tibet specialist along on the trip to talk about some of those issues. At the same time, independent observers like Amnesty International, Physicians for Human Rights, have come out with reports detailing still many atrocities, nuns and monks in prisons and so on, real problems, particularly in that part. So the question then is, how do we find out where the real facts are? What can you do and what can we do in this country to ensure that these kinds of facts come to light for the people of China and for the people of this country to be aware of?
Well, I think that's a very good question. And interestingly enough, as the religious leaders left China, the Catholic bishop stated that he said, this is an impossible task. No matter what we do or what we say, we're going to offend large numbers of people. And China is a very vast country, just as the United States is. You remember the fable of the 6 blind men or the 7 blind men that went to the elephant, and one grabbed his tail and thought it was a snake, and one grabbed his trunk and thought it was something else, and one grabbed the elephant's foot and thought it was a tree, et cetera, et cetera. I mean, we can only judge by what we see. But I don't think these religious leaders felt that their whole trip was stage managed. I think they would tell you, if they were here this evening, that clearly the Chinese did everything they could to put their best foot forward. But the religious leaders demanded certain things that the Chinese let them do and certain things they didn't. For example, they demanded to go to a prison in Tibet, and they went. And so I think their report it conforms to what we see in China. Now, true, we diplomats do not get into penal institutions, but the Chinese have agreed to, unless we've got an American citizen incarcerated, then we get over there and try to get them out. But the Chinese have indicated that there's a strong likelihood they will agree to visits to their penal institutions by the International Red Cross. Perhaps we can get a more unbiased approach there. But I think you just have to continue to read as much as you can and try to learn as much as you can. And bear in mind that many of the organizations on both sides of the issue, whether they're pro-Chinese or anti-Chinese or grounded in civil rights or represent the business community or whatnot, human rights represent the business community, they all have their own individual viewpoint. You're obviously a very bright young man, and I just say continue to try to inform yourself.
Good evening, Ambassador. My name is Robert Lee. I'm a second-year student here at the Kennedy School. You opened your remarks with a grim description of the tension during March 1996 with the missile launches. And I'd like to ask about Taiwan now. Recent elections have indicated that the DPP has been doing very strongly and there's an increasing possibility that the DPP may win the presidency in the year 2000. This to me seems like an early warning signal that the tensions are likely to increase leading up to the elections. What are the current thoughts on the U.S. playing a more creative, proactive role in dissolving that conflict so we can avoid that type of tension?
Well, as you know, our policy has been, and I think will continue to be in the future, that the issue is a Chinese issue, one to be settled by those on the mainland and those on Taiwan. And our only conviction is that it ought to be settled peacefully. That is official U.S. policy, and I don't anticipate any change in that in the future. Now, there are encouraging things on the horizon. The Chinese government has indicated they want to resume the cross-strait dialogue. The authorities on Taiwan have indicated that they are willing to resume the cross-strait dialogue if they wish to do so as well. So at least they're starting to talk to each other more now. And I think there's probably more communication going on back and forth than we know about. And so I continue to hope that time is on the side of a peaceful resolution that will be satisfactory to both the people on the mainland and the people on Taiwan. I think, given time, that can be done. And with regard to the DPP, just one, many times parties out of power, when they get into power and see the reality of situations, they moderate some of their opinions or some of the statements they made prior to assuming the role of governing party.
Thank you.
That's where I learned it, I guess.
My name is Joanne Fan. I'm a second year at the Kennedy School here.
Oh.
Hi. I applaud U.S. commitment to engage China. And just to build upon the question from my colleague before, while U.S. is committed in engaging the Chinese government, there seems to be a curious trend in confining Taiwan into a certain path that's yet in ambiguity. As a viable economic player, Taiwan's achievements are not included in the IMF statistics. Although Taiwan has already concluded the bilateral talks prior to the WTO negotiations, it's still not admitted to the organization and due to political reasons. And the will of the Taiwanese people is to be represented at the UN, and U.S. has specifically said that it would not support that particular movement. I understand that there's encouraging signs from both sides to a peaceful resolution. But what can the U.S. do in creating a level playing field so that in order to provide that confidence level before they resume the negotiation across the Taiwan Strait?
Well, I think the United States has already done something to help create a level playing field when it's stated that its policy is that this is an issue to be resolved by the Chinese, but we want that decision to come by way of peaceful resolution. Now, of course, I think that helps level the playing field. But in the final analysis, I think we've got to realize that neither the United States nor any other nation or group of nations is going to be able to dictate a solution in the Taiwan Straits or to the Taiwan mainland question. I think what we need is patience. I think we need to listen carefully to both sides. I think we need to be sympathetic where we can, helpful where we're asked to help, but we simply are not going to be able to fashion a solution by ourselves. But by simply saying the resolution must be peaceful, I think that creates quite a level playing field.
Thank you for being here, Ambassador. My name is Samuel Shapiro. I'm a first-year student at the Divinity School. And you just mentioned being sympathetic and listening to discussion. And I wanted to bring up the issue of Tibet with you, because you haven't really touched on that. You've talked about quality of life improving in China for Chinese, but I don't think you've addressed Tibetans in particular who have a much different situation. And unfortunately, the media has not discussed what is going on right now. There's a hunger strike in India right now, and we have 6 Tibetans there in exile who are on day 22 of a hunger strike and are expected to die soon. And their demands are very simple. I'll just keep this briefly, and then I'd like to ask you what you might do about this. One is to resume the United Nations debate on the question of Tibet based on its resolutions in 1959, 1961, and 1965. The second is to appoint a special reporter to investigate the situation of China and occupied Tibet. And the last demand is to appoint a special envoy to promote a peaceful settlement of the question of Tibet and initiate a United Nations supervised plebiscite to ascertain the wishes of the Tibetan people. Very simple. And it seems interesting to me that the United States will go in and take a more proactive role when we have economic interests. But when we don't, we hear things like, we'll just listen, we'll understand, we'll empathize. The situation in Tibet is horrendous in terms of human rights violations. I know that can be argued, and I don't expect you to agree or disagree with that. But I'd like you to know, as a person who is in a position of great power and who somebody can do something constructive to improve human rights situations in Tibet, what you have done and what you hope to do.
Well, as a matter of fact, my wife and I went to Tibet a few months ago, and there we met with the Vice Governor of Tibet. We discussed with him the question of human rights, discussed with him the question of what was happening with the Tibetan culture, both as far as the monasteries were concerned and the curriculum for teaching the Tibetan language in the schools. We visited some monasteries, one as high as 16,000 feet. I thought I was going to expire before we got out of there from lack of oxygen. But Tibet is a very serious problem in a lot of ways, and we have tried to tell the Chinese that it's a problem for them, that Tibet creates a lot of ill will for China around the country, around the world, and that we are hopeful that they would open some sort of dialogue with the Tibetan exile leader, or perhaps even the Dalai Lama at some point. But so far, no real progress on that. Now, historically, the United States has recognized Tibet as part of China since, if memory serves me correctly, 1916. We don't contest the fact that Tibet is a part of China. Our quarrel with the Chinese over Tibet comes about as a result of a feeling that the Tibetan culture is being overwhelmed by the culture of the Chinese, and that the Tibetans are being ill-treated. But we have an ongoing dialogue with them about it. And when former President Carter was there last year, he had some very frank discussions in an unofficial way. He's not an official of the United States government, with the President of China about Tibet. But so far, we've seen no movement. Yes, right here, please.
Ambassador Sasser, my name is Dan Schnur. I'm a fellow at the Institute of Politics. And although I disagree with both the administration's and the Republican Congress's position on most favored nation status for China, I wanted to tell you, as I think everyone would agree, how appreciative we are that you've joined us here this evening.
Thank you.
You mentioned a moment ago the President's upcoming trip to mainland China.
Yes.
And my question has to do with the timing of that trip. The President has recently visited South Africa, and in that country commemorated the release of Nelson Mandela from that country's prison system. When he visited France, it was to commemorate the anniversary of the Allies' landing at Normandy. Does it not send an unfortunate signal to visit China on the anniversary of the Tiananmen massacre?
Well, Tiananmen occurred on June the 4th, and the President won't arrive in China until some 3 or 4 or 5 weeks thereafter. And we are hopeful that there will be the release of other dissidents. We have no way of knowing, but we're very hopeful that other dissidents will be released, either prior to the president's visit or contemporaneous with it or afterwards. And some of these may be holdovers from some of the protests in Tiananmen. I think that the Tiananmen incident is tragic. It occurred now almost 9 years ago. And there have been many, many, many changes in China since then. And many think that the man who authorized that repression is now gone. And there's a new leadership there that perhaps would have reacted differently. Zhu Rongji, the new premier of China, was the mayor of Shanghai at the time of Tiananmen. And it was not just in Beijing that there were mass protests. In many of the major cities all over China, including Shanghai. And in Shanghai, Zhu Rongji went on television, addressed the people in a very profound and sympathetic way, and the folks went home in Shanghai with no loss of life. It's a shame that couldn't have happened in Beijing.
Good evening, Ambassador. My name is Greg Koblenz. I'm a student here at the Kennedy School. As you know, India's new government has announced a policy of deploying nuclear weapons, which could lead to an arms race with Pakistan and the Indian subcontinent. What are the implications of that situation for China's recent pledges not to transfer nuclear or missile technology to Pakistan?
Well, it puts the Chinese in a very difficult position because historically they've been friendly with the Pakistanis, and they have sold weapons to the Pakistanis in times past. So this is going to put, this could put very substantial pressure on the Chinese to move forward and assist the Pacs. I don't think, my own opinion is that they will not. They have other interest. It appears to me now that Chinese foreign policy is predicated primarily on creating no turbulence around their borders, befriending all of the nations in that area so they can concentrate all of their energies on internal economic development, because they've got a long, long, long way to go there. The average per capita income using American dollars as a standard in China is just about $768 per person the last time I looked. And although in the cities it's much higher, and you can find people who are very wealthy in some of the cities, still on a per capita basis they've got a long way to go, and that's what they're focusing on, internal economic development in my judgment. They don't want any problems on the border with India or Pakistan.
Good evening, Ambassador. I'm Charles D. Simone. I'm a freshman at Harvard College, and I was curious if you had any thoughts about the problems China will be facing as a result of massive rural immigration, and also the problems with displaced workers from state-owned companies and the burden that will place on the social welfare system.
That's a very good question, and that's the, as I said earlier, that's the $64,000 question. There already is a very difficult problem of agricultural workers coming into urban areas looking for jobs. Many of them have been finding jobs on construction sites. Now, some figures indicate that there's as many as from 60 to 100 million sort of floating population workers looking for work in China. But if China gets into an economic turndown and these construction projects in the cities start shutting down, then you're going to create really, I think, substantial pockets of unemployment in many of the major cities. Also, as they downsize the government from 40 ministries to 29 ministries, this is going to put hundreds of thousands, perhaps millions of people out of work. On top of that, as they move away from state-owned enterprises and shut some of the state-owned enterprises down that are unprofitable, this is going to displace millions of workers. And the truth is there's not any social welfare system or social safety net to amount to anything in China outside of the workplace. And when the workplace shuts down, they can rely primarily just on their families. So this is going to be a very dodgy situation, I think, over the next few years. How do you move forward with economic reform and deal with all of the unemployed that this is going to create in the years before the economy catches up and starts re-employing people? Now, the Chinese leadership will talk bravely about, well, we're going to create jobs in the service industry. We don't have any service industry in China. Well, maybe so, but that's going to take a while to do that. This is going to be a very interesting thing to watch because all of these millions of unemployed, that is potential social and political dynamite. And already there are, almost every day we read of workers' strikes or riots someplace in China.
Thank you.
Mr. Ambassador, my name is John Bullard up here.
Yes.
I'm a fellow as you were, and thank you, as everyone else has, for coming.
I hope you enjoy your fellowship as much as I enjoyed mine.
We are having a great time.
Great.
I want to return to the issue of climate change that
Yes.
you raised in your remarks. The Senate, as you know, voted 95-0 that they would not ratify a treaty that didn't include the developing countries. China and other developing countries have said that they don't want to lock in the disparity of standard of living that currently exists by agreeing to the same kind of limits. Now, with your unique perspective, your knowledge of China, your knowledge of the Senate, how do you think this could get resolved where there could be a treaty or convention that everyone could be a part of, the Senate could ratify, China could be part of?
Well, I think if, in moments of candor, I think the leaders of China would tell you that they've got to do something about air pollution and water pollution in China. Last year, I think it was, there was a hotline in Beijing where the citizens could call in and register protests. And they kept it open, I think, for 2 days and then shut it down. Senator Simpson, I know that's a bad idea to open up these hotlines, but in any case, they thought the protests would be about, high rents, high food prices, corruption, government, et cetera. 80% of it was complaining about dirty air and dirty water. And in my conversations with the mayor of Beijing, I asked him, what are your two largest problems? Every large city has problems. He said, first is transporting citizens, and second is pollution of air and water, and third is disposal of garbage. Well, that would be just the same if you talked almost to the mayor of Boston. So welling up in the population of China, or any other city, not just Boston, London or any place else, but welling up, I think, from a grassroots in China is a demand to do something about the air and water pollution. So that's pushing. And then I think the Chinese leadership knows that it can't go on the way it is. And ultimately, we hope that reason will prevail in the United States Senate the way it did when Senator Simpson and I were there on these very important and vital issues. The whole question, I think, of climate change is an idea dealing with the problem of climate change or global problems is an idea whose time has come almost. And the fact that the treaty was negotiated, I think, is significant. And so let's give it a couple of 3 more years and see what happens. 2 more questions, yes.
Mr. Ambassador, I'm Zhao Huifei, coming from People's Republic of China. I just want to bring to your attention a practical issue. That is the unacceptable treatment by the Chinese visa applicants in the visa division of U.S. Embassy in Beijing.
Yes.
I say this based on my personal experience and what I know and what I have witnessed.
Well, I
My
agree
wife
with you.
actually had that unpleasant experience on 2 occasions. Like hundreds of other Chinese citizens applying for visa, they stood in a line for 4 or 5 hours outside the embassy, fine or rain. And they pay 400 yuan, which is equivalent to 2 weeks' pay, wage of an average Chinese worker.
$50.
$50, yes. And then in 10 seconds, they got a denial without the full justification. When she tried to seek any explanation, she got refused with very bad manner. And I'm not so naive as to seek a visa for my wife here from Your Excellency. But what matters, thank you. What matters here is it's not my unique experience. Unfortunately, such a maltreatment occurs every day to most Chinese applicants for a visa to the United States, for whatever the reason. So the visa application is the first contact between the Chinese and the American people. And these officers are representing the image of American government and American people. So the image of American people should not be tarnished by such infamous practice. If you ask everybody, they have this feeling. So Chinese people should be treated with dignity and decency. So I just want to mention the last sentence. The normal exchange between the two countries should not be abstracted by a visa office which is designed to be a bridge for the friendship and exchange of the two peoples. And I just wonder, is there anything, Your Excellency, you can do to prevent such a practice from happening again? Thank you.
Well, I think you're giving us a very accurate account of what occurred. And it's a very, very serious problem. And we are working and trying to deal with that problem in every way that we can. Now let me tell you what our problem is. It's not your problem, it's my problem as the ambassador. One, U.S. law is written in such a way that the burden of proof is on the visa applicant, with a presumption that the visa applicant will not return to China or the country that they're applying from when their visa expires. So you have a very heavy burden of proof under U.S. law to prove that you should be allowed a visa and that you will return to China. Now, our experience has been that for example, in Guangzhou in southern China, in our embassy, our consulate there, 90% of the Chinese students that were granted visas did not return to China. So this puts a heavy burden on these visa officers to try to make sure that they'll come back. Now, on top of that, the young Foreign Service officers manning those visa lines have just started. This is their first job in the State Department. It's amazing that they don't all quit and go home. Secondly, the funding for the State Department, listen to this, Alan, has been reduced so dramatically in real terms over the past 15 years that we don't have the personnel to, that's the reason you got a 10-second interview, because the personnel is not there to go and spend the time with each one. Now, this is not your problem. Well, it is your problem. It's a problem for me we've got to deal with. And lastly, we have had an absolute explosion in visa applicants from China to the United States over the past 6 or 7 or 8 years, and we're essentially operating with the same personnel we had 6 or 8 years ago, and we've got 400% more applicants. But this has been brought to the attention of the Secretary of State. She has issued a directive worldwide indicating to State Department personnel that the visa window is usually the first place that citizens have a contact with the United States, and we need to do a better job, and we're going to continue to try to do so.
Thank you.
And I apologize for the bad experience that you had.
Thank you very much. I appreciate it.
Yes.
Hello, thank you very much for speaking here. My name is Darian Unger. I'm from MIT. First of all, I also want to thank you for calling attention to the protest here at Harvard. It's good to know that we were noted by the billion or so people in China, and I expect to see democracy break out on Wednesday. But some of us protesting actually enjoy being the loud voice to coincide with the cooperation and dialogue that we are continuing with China. I expect that this strategy may in fact work on a lot of the issues that we're discussing, arms, human rights, and we may be able to see steps that we in the United States consider positive from emerging from China, except on one, which is on environmental issues. You mentioned this a little bit before, saying it's a time that has almost come. But in fact, here is a country that needs energy, that has a tremendous population that is underfed with energy and has enough coal that they could probably burn for longer than our country has even been in existence. The time has almost come. What breakthrough is necessary for this to actually happen? Because it seems to be a much tougher issue than you allowed in your answer.
Well, it is a tough issue, and but you've got to bear in mind that the Chinese are very inefficient in their production of energy. I mean, the Japanese are, I think, twice as efficient as we are in energy production, and we're 5 times more efficient than the Chinese are. And what clean coal technology could do an enormous amount for the atmosphere of China and for the atmosphere of the world, and particularly for the atmosphere of Japan, where a lot of that stuff blows over. The Chinese are moving in the direction of natural gas. They've run a natural gas line now into Beijing. They're trying to move in Beijing. The average person heats their home and cooks with a little pressed soft coal dust pellet, which spews out all kinds of pollution. They're running gas lines into the homes, so they'll quit using that. They've now decreed that in Beijing that you must use unleaded gas. That's supposed to go into effect nationwide in the year 2000. Unfortunately, there are no catalytic converters on automobiles there, not even the ambassador's car, because you still get a mixture sometimes of leaded and unleaded gas. That'll poison the catalytic converter. But they've got to switch over to catalytic converters and a whole host of things that can be done. But the bottom line is, and you're quite correct, that this is going to be a continuing problem for a country of 1.3 billion people, growing to 1.6 billion over the next 35 or 40 years before it levels off, as they continue to industrialize and try to expand their standard of living. It's China's problem with pollution is rapidly becoming a worldwide problem.
Thank you very much, old friend.
Well, thank you.
Thank you. And thank you to the audience, and I'm just sorry that we can't get to all of the questions. We have a reception and some people wanting to meet with the ambassador. Let me just clarify one thing. It was not a slip of the tongue when the ambassador mentioned President Gore. You see, President Gore was the president of the Senate, and Jim and I referred to him when he presided as President Gore. I wanted to get that clarified, and then say that you were certainly right when you said the party out of power moderates its positions when attaining power. I learned that, and Senator Sasser learned that. It's a very important lesson, a very real part of politics, that when the ones who are chipping away all the time suddenly get the power, they fall toward the middle. It works in every legislative body that I've ever known. And your transition, sir, from legislator to diplomat is remarkable and superb. And I wish you well in your stewardship on behalf of our country in this vitally important People's Republic of China. Thank you for being here.